Hello, and welcome to Educating Marshmallow. This is the fourth lecture on Hamlet, which will be the last one of this series. And in this lecture, I'd like to introduce a concept that is sort of analogous to this concept of bad faith that I talked about in a previous lecture, which was Sartre's idea that we perform roles that we know are inauthentic, but we manage to deceive ourselves into thinking that they are freely chosen. This new concept is called imitative desire, or mimetic desire. And it's a concept that René Girard, another French thinker, introduced to analyze a lot of different texts, but primarily Shakespeare, because he regarded Shakespeare as the sort of world's leading expert on mimetic desire, because so many of Shakespeare's players imitate each other, are envious of each other, strive with and against each other for the same objects. And he sees Hamlet as a play as very much about mimetic desire, revenge, tragedies, of course. You know, the whole eye for an eye is about that cycle of mimetic violence, right? You kill someone in my family, I kill someone, I kill the killer. And the cycle goes on and on. Anyway, Hamlet definitely is motivated to some extent by this mimetic desire. And the first instance we see of this really taking shape in the play is in Act 4, Scene 4, when he encounters some soldiers going from Norway to Poland to fight and die, some of them over a very small piece of land. And he sees this as a spur to his revenge. And he wonders, why haven't I managed to, avenge my father's death? And then he accuses himself of thinking too precisely on the event, which is what we would basically call overthinking. And at the end of that speech, he talks about his resolution to basically kill whoever he needs to. My thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth. And indeed, when he's sent to England, he intercepts a letter that then he rewrites to condemn Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, his school friends, to death. So he has been motivated by this mimetic desire to get blood by observing Fortinbras's willingness to shed blood over a tiny piece of land that's really not worth it. The second and kind of most scandalous instance of mimetic desire in this part of the play is Hamlet coming upon Ophelia's funeral, where Laertes is indeed kind of going over the top in his demonstrations of grief. He jumps into the grave with Ophelia and yells, "Now pile your dust upon the quick and dead, till of this flat a mountain you have made to o'ertop old Pelion, or the skyish head of blue Olympus." And here Hamlet is offended by this extreme grief, this theatrical grief that Laertes is showing. He says, "What is he whose grief bears such an emphasis, whose phrase of sorrow conjures the wondering stars and makes them stand like wonder-wounded hearers? This is I, Hamlet the Dane." And he goes after Laertes, and they fight in Ophelia's grave. A moment of extreme indecorum, to say the very least. And Hamlet's not content with that. After they're separated, he basically takes up the same hyperbolic tone that Laertes was using to give a little speech about Ophelia, his love for Ophelia. 40,000 brothers could not, with all their quantity of love, make up my sum. What will you do for her? Would weep, would fight, would fast, would tear thyself. I'll do it Dost thou come here to whine, to outface me with leaping in her grave? Be buried quick with her, and so will I. If thou prate of mountains, let them throw millions of acres on us. Nay, and thou'lt mouth, I'll rant as well as thou. So Hamlet knows he's ranting. He knows he's going over the top. But this is the sort of fit of mimetic desire that Laertes' passionate outburst of grief in Ophelia's grave has prompted in him, in the same way that he's motivated to express his feelings after watching the actor perform the play in which Hecuba is lamenting Priam's death. And so the reason this theory of mimetic desire is important is because it's essentially a version of affectation, right? It's the idea that you're not motivated by any inborn natural urges, natural affections, to use that word, but rather you're influenced by or affected by some outside factors that spur you on to imitate someone else's actions or words. And we can see that pretty well describes Hamlet's behavior in the play. He is reactive rather than active. So all this prepares us for the appearance of Osric in the final scene of the play. And a lot of scholars of the play have scratched their heads and wondered why Shakespeare put this lightweight courtier who's flamboyantly dressed, who's very young, and who speaks in this outlandish dialect of his own invention, it would seem, at such a crucial point in Shakespeare's most intellectually ambitious tragedy. Well, for me, the reason's not hard to find. It's because Osric is finally the embodiment, the unmistakable avatar of affectation that Hamlet has kind of been like trying to define, trying to understand without ever being able to use the word of affectation itself. He uses affection instead, as we've seen. But Osric is so over the top affected that you cannot possibly mistake him for anything resembling natural passion or anything like that. So when Osric makes his appearance, Hamlet asks Horatio, "Dost thou know this waterfly?" Suggesting, a tiny insignificant creature. Horatio replies, "No, my good lord," and he says, "Thy state is the more gracious, for 'tis a vice to know him." And yet Hamlet clearly does know him. He talks about Osric's peasant background, how he's come to court recently, and that's a sign of the decline, really, of Elsinore as a courtly society. And then Hamlet sort of makes Osric feel uncomfortable by telling him to put his hat back on. Osric feels more comfortable being obsequious and keeping his hat off. And then he gets Osric to contradict himself about whether it's hot or cold. So Hamlet is just playing around with this guy. He knows he's a lightweight, and he knows he can sort of confuse him because Osric so desperately wants to please him. Here is the living example of someone who has o'erleavened the form of plausive manners in the way that we talked about in the first lecture, where in trying to be pleasing, you end up being ridiculous. And that's where Osric is at this point. And then Osric presumes to inform Hamlet about Laertes' wonderful character. And he gives a little speech in praise of Laertes. He says, "Here is newly come to court Laertes," which is not really true. Laertes has been at court before. But anyway, "Believe me, an absolute gentleman, full of most excellent differences, of very soft society and great showing. Indeed, to speak sellingly of him, he is the card or calendar of gentry. And then Hamlet kind of senses that this is BS, basically, that Osric doesn't really know Laertes, and certainly Hamlet knows every bit as much of Laertes as Osric does, but Osric wants to seem more familiar with people of higher status than he is, which again is a classic sign of affectation as it was understood in the Renaissance. There were lots of portraits of affected courtiers like Osric, so that the audience in Shakespeare's time would have immediately recognized that Osric was affectation in human form. And then in another bit of imitative desire, Hamlet uses his own version of Osric's excessively flowery, almost nonsensical language and takes it to an extreme when he replies to Osric about Laertes. Hamlet says, "Sir, his definement suffers no perdition in you, though I know to define him inventorially would dozy the arithmetic of memory, yet but neither in respect of his quick sail, but in the verity of extolment I take him to be a soul of great article, and his infusion of such dearth and rareness as to make true diction of him, his semblable is his mirror, and who else would trace him, his umbrage, nothing more." So they're kind of having a contest to see who can praise Laertes in the most outlandish terms possible. And Osric, of course, is impressed by Hamlet's nonsense because it's his currency as well. Osric replies, "Your lordship speaks most infallibly of him." And then Hamlet comes back and asks, "The concernancy, sir." And again, this is a word that's not really a word in the English language at all. Why do we wrap the gentleman in our more rawer breath? The redundancy of more rawer is pretty clear. And Hamlet's words confuse Osric, who, what? And they have a little exchange where Hamlet rephrases the question, Osric is flustered, and Horatio says his purse is empty already, all his golden words are spent. So in other words, Osric has clearly prepared a little oration to praise Laertes and to invite Hamlet to this fencing match. And once that prepared oration has been given, Osric can't converse naturally afterwards. Anyway, eventually Osric manages to get his wits back together, explains the terms of the wager that's going to happen on the fencing match, and invites Hamlet. And Osric exits, saying, "I commend my duty to your lordship," and Hamlet can't resist a parting shot as Osric is leaving, saying to Horatio, "Does well to commend it himself, there are no tongues else for his turn." So the idea that people would praise themselves, commend themselves, was a pretty common form of affectation. Again, in the early modern conception of this vice, which became sort of the buzzword in a way of Shakespeare's generation, that there were tracts being published at the time. There was something called Of Affectation, a Moral Treatise of much use. It really was the zeitgeist that everyone was accusing everybody else of. And so people were on the lookout for it. Flattery, which is a tool that Osric uses for Hamlet, as well as for Laertes. Flattery was deemed to be a classic tool of the affected courtier. But Hamlet and Horatio have seen through Osric, and they kind of deconstruct him in a way. And Hamlet goes on to say that he, Osric, and many more of the same breed that I know the drossy age dotes on, only got the tune of the time. In other words, they're basically like they're going with the flow. The trend of the time is affectation in one's manners and speech. And out of an habit of encounter, a kind of yeasty collection which carries them through and through the most profound and winnowed opinions, and do but blow them to their trial, their bubbles are out. So this is sort of what's happened with Osric. He has made a little collection of nice words and new fangled phrases that he trots out for occasions, but if you blow too hard, those little bubbles burst, their golden words are spent, and they show that they're not really as educated or as graceful as they would like to seem. But they are very much of their time. They are, in fact, the prevailing spirit of courtly life is towards this sort of affectation. Now, Osric's lightweight status should not obscure the fact that he's there to do a very important task. For the play, he is there to basically invite Hamlet to this fencing match with Laertes under the pretext that it's just a friendly sporting wager, right, Marcy? That there's no violent undercurrent. This has nothing to do with the fact that Hamlet has killed Polonius, Laertes' father, and caused Ophelia to drown herself as well. So Osric has to kind of conceal all the dark motives behind the invitation to the fencing match. And he actually does a darn good job of doing so, because Hamlet is too busy making fun of Osric with Horatio to really think too much about the invitation. Although it's clear after Osric is gone, once the invitation's been accepted, Hamlet has some second thoughts. He said, "Thou wouldst not think how ill all is here about my heart, but it is no matter." So in a way, what Osric has done is he has allowed Hamlet to finally confront affectation in the flesh, free himself of that worry, right? He's like, okay, I must not be as guilty of affectation as this guy. He clearly is. And so after that, Hamlet is able to put aside his, private fears or misgivings and go and basically face his final nemesis, Laertes, in the fencing match that will turn into a deadly fight, and which will eventually kill Hamlet. So, in the final analysis, what we have in the play is Hamlet acting as a kind of detective, looking for affectation, finding hints of it here, hints of it there, in himself and in other characters, but always confusing it with some other idea or some other phrase, some other word, i.e. affection, until he meets Osric, the unmistakable representative of this concept. And Osric is so ridiculous, so much the comic foil for him, that Hamlet can finally shed his anxieties, his inhibitions, his self-doubts, and go to perform his task as the revenger in the final scene of the play, where he does, in fact, kill Claudius and avenge his father. Of course, in the meantime, he's been mortally wounded and will die. But after this, after Shakespeare, basically, affectation is no longer really associated with tragedy. It becomes a purely comic vice. And it is so prevalent in restoration drama, for instance, as just something to laugh about. The characters in restoration drama, they all know the word affectation. They know what it looks like. They know what it sounds like. And they also know that they themselves participate in a social world where it is everywhere. And it is something to be laughed at, as opposed to a tragic sort of misunderstanding that, is what cripples Hamlet in a way, because he doesn't have that concept quite down pat yet. But through Osric's appearance, he can finally realize, aha, this is the thing that's been sort of like circling around me, that I've been afraid of, that I've been, suspecting that I might be guilty of, because I'm delaying my revenge, I'm thinking too much, etc., etc. So in a way, Shakespeare performs a catharsis in the tragedy, but the emotion, or the thing that's being exorcised from the social world, is the idea that affectation is a dangerous, like, contagion that can rob us of our authenticity. Rather, it turns into a comic fault or vice that we all kind of know we might be guilty of now and then, but it's not reason for violence. It's more something to laugh at. And that's how it generally shows up in restoration drama. Anyway, end of lecture, and thank you very much for sticking with it. See you next time.